Andrew Wilson was 36 years old, and to anyone who passed him on the street, he was precisely what he looked like. A man in a sensible coat. A man with a government ID badge clipped to his breast pocket. A man who drove a 6-year-old Ford Fusion with a small crack in the passenger side mirror that he kept meaning to fix. A man who packed his lunch in a navy blue insulated bag every single morning without being asked, without making a performance of it, without expecting applause. He was, by every visible measure, ordinary. That was the word his mother-in-law Diane Hargrove had used at Easter dinner 2 years ago, when she thought Andrew had stepped outside. He had not stepped outside. He had been standing 3 feet from the kitchen doorway when he heard her say it to her daughter in a voice that carried the specific softness of a woman sharing a private verdict she had already decided was fact. "He's just so ordinary, baby. You deserve extraordinary." He had stood there for one full breath. Then he walked to the backyard and stayed until dinner was called. He never mentioned it. Not to his wife Camille. Not to anyone. That was how Andrew operated. He filed things. He stored them in the careful, quiet architecture of a man who had learned early that knowing something and acting on it were two completely different forms of power, and that the second one only arrived when the timing was exactly right. The morning of the divorce papers was a Tuesday in November. Andrew had been up since 4:30. He woke early the way some people read. Not because they had to, because the quiet before the world started was the only time that genuinely belonged to him. He made coffee, dark roast, in the kitchen while the house was still and blue and cold, and he stood at the window that faced the backyard and looked at nothing in particular. The yard needed work. The hedges along the fence line had gone ragged. He had been meaning to trim them for 3 weeks. Camille's car was still in the driveway when he left at 7. That meant she had not spent the night elsewhere, which was notable because there had been 4 nights in the past 6 weeks when she had. Each time, the reason was different. Her sister's place. A work function that ran late. A hotel closer to the venue of whatever event she had been attending. The reasons were not the point. The pattern was. Andrew drove to work along the same road he had driven for 4 years, parked in the same numbered spot, and walked into the offices of Meridian Federal Consulting carrying his lunch bag and the kind of expression that told the room he was already thinking about the problem in front of him. He was a government contracts analyst. His job was to review, structure, and maintain compliance frameworks for federal procurement agreements. It was detail work. It was quiet work. It was the kind of work that required an almost uncomfortable tolerance for precision, for reading the same document 7 times until every sentence had been accounted for. He was exceptional at it. Nobody at Meridian Federal knew what Andrew held outside of his 9 to 5. That was deliberate. That had always been deliberate. Camille called at 12:15. He looked at the screen for 1 ring. Then he answered. "Are you coming home for lunch?" she asked. "No. I brought." A pause. "Okay." And then, quieter, almost to herself. "Okay." Something in the second "okay" sat wrong. He couldn't name it precisely. But he filed it, the way he filed everything. He ate at his desk. He went back to the compliance framework he had been building for a regional logistics company that had recently won a federal supply contract. He checked 3 sets of figures twice, corrected 1 error in a formula, and printed the revised summary before 4 o'clock. He was home by 6. Camille was already there. She was sitting at the kitchen table, not eating, not looking at her phone, not doing any of the things she normally did when she arrived before him. She was just sitting. Her hands were in her lap. Her face was arranged very carefully, the way a face looks when someone has been practicing an expression and has not fully committed to it yet. On the table in front of her was an envelope. Andrew set his bag down near the door. He took off his coat. He hung it on the hook in the hallway. He walked to the cabinet and pulled down a glass and filled it with water from the tap and drank half of it standing at the sink. He turned around. "What's that?" he asked, nodding at the envelope, even though the weight of the moment had already told him. Camille's hands came up from her lap and folded on the table. "Andrew." She said his name like a complete sentence. Like the sentence contained everything she had already decided and was now delivering. "I filed for divorce," she said. "Last Friday." He walked to the table. He sat down across from her. He picked up the envelope and opened it slowly. He read every page without rushing, the way he read everything. The filing was detailed. It was more detailed than it should have been for a straightforward separation. He noticed that immediately. He set the papers down. He looked at her. Whose attorney wrote this? He asked. Something moved across her face. Mine. Your family recommended him? She didn't answer right away. My father knew someone. Andrew nodded once. He straightened the papers back into the envelope. He set it on the table with the same care someone uses to set down something fragile. Is there someone else? He asked. Simple. Direct. No emotion attached. Camille looked at the table. That's not what this is about. That's not an answer, Camille. She looked up, and in her eyes, there was something he hadn't expected. Not defiance. Not guilt exactly. Something closer to relief. The relief of a woman who had been holding a secret so long that even being caught felt like setting down weight. His name is Derek, she said. Andrew sat with that for a moment. The name landed in him the way cold water lands. Sharp at first, then settling. How long? He asked. She hesitated. 8 months. 8 months. He thought about that. 8 months of a different perfume. 8 months of the small shifts in her attention, her patience, the way she laughed at things on her phone and tilted the screen away when he walked into the room. 8 months of a pattern he had been watching without naming. He had named it now. He stood up. He walked to the kitchen sink and rinsed his water glass. He dried it with the dish towel hanging from the oven handle and set it back in the cabinet. He turned around. I'm going to need a few days, he said. Don't rush me on the paperwork. Camille blinked. She had clearly prepared herself for something different. Anger, maybe. Or collapse. Or the specific kind of pleading that men perform when they haven't seen something coming. She had not prepared for calm. Andrew, I'm not doing this tonight, he said. Quietly. Firmly. Without a single raised note. I'm going to eat dinner. If you want to stay tonight, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine too. He turned to the refrigerator and opened it and began pulling out what he needed. She stayed. She ate in silence across from him. She went upstairs at 9:30. He sat at the kitchen table alone after she was gone, not brooding, not unraveling, just sitting in the quiet with his hands flat on the table, looking at the space between them. Then he picked up his phone and sent a single text. I need to talk. Tomorrow. Early. He went upstairs at 10. He lay on his side of the bed and looked at the ceiling. The fan turned without sound. Camille's breathing was steady. He closed his eyes. He was already thinking. The name on the lease agreement was Leland Hargrove. Andrew knew it the way he knew most things that mattered. Not because anyone told him, but because he had looked at the right time, in the right document, with the right kind of patience. Leland Hargrove was Camille's father, a broad-shouldered man of 61 who wore his silver hair close-cut and his opinions loudly, and who had never once in 4 years of Sunday dinners given Andrew a handshake that felt like he meant it. Leland ran Hargrove Supply and Distribution, a regional materials supplier operating across 4 southeastern states. It was, by every measure Leland communicated, a legacy, a Hargrove legacy. His grandfather had started it with a single truck and 2 county contracts. His father had built it into something respectable. Leland had taken it further, or told the story that way, and his wife Diane repeated the story so regularly at dinner tables that it had taken on the authority of Scripture. What Leland did not say at dinner tables, what Leland had never said anywhere public, was that Hargrove Supply and Distribution had been operating on borrowed life for the past 3 years. Andrew knew this because it was his job to know it. Not because he had gone looking for the Hargroves. Because the Hargroves had come looking for him, or rather, for the federal supply framework he managed, without knowing the two were connected. 18 months ago, Hargrove Supply had won a regional materials contract through Meridian Federal Consulting's procurement division. A solid contract. A 5-year term. Renewable. The kind of federal business relationship that kept a mid-size operation stable, that kept its credit lines open, that kept its bank from asking difficult questions about its debt-to-revenue ratio. Andrew had built the compliance framework that got Hargrove Supply approved. He had reviewed every document. He had structured the agreement. His signature was on the compliance certification that made the contract executable. Without the contract, Hargrove Supply's primary lender would have called its line of credit within 90 days. The financials were that close to the edge. Andrew had seen the supporting documents. He had read them the way he read everything. Thoroughly, without judgment, storing every line. He had never mentioned it to Camille. He had never mentioned it to anyone outside of work. He met Renata Cole the next morning at a coffee shop 2 blocks from his office. Renata was a contract attorney he had worked with on 3 separate compliance matters over the past 2 years. She was precise, she was fast, and she understood federal procurement law the way surgeons understood anatomy, not as theory, but as living, moving structure. She was already at the corner table when he arrived, a cup of tea steaming in front of her, her laptop open, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked up when he walked in. Read his face in one glance the way sharp people read situations before anyone speaks. Sit, she said. He sat. He ordered coffee. He told her everything in a sequence that moved the way his thinking moved. Chronological, sourced, nothing assumed. When he finished, Renata was quiet for a moment. She turned her teacup on its saucer one slow rotation. The divorce filing targeted your consulting income and 2 investment accounts, she said. Yes. But not the contract you manage. No. Andrew looked at her. They don't know about the connection. Leland has no idea I'm the analyst who built his compliance framework. The work goes through the firm. My name is internal documentation only. And if the contract compliance certification were reviewed, Renata said carefully, for any administrative irregularity during a renewal audit, it would flag a hold on disbursements, Andrew said. 60 to 90 days minimum. Possibly longer, depending on the review queue. Renata took off her reading glasses and set them on the table. She looked at him the way someone looks when they have grasped the full shape of something and are deciding how to hold it. Andrew, she said, I know. You haven't done anything yet. I know. So what do you want to do? He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He looked out the window at the street outside. A woman was walking a dog that was pulling in 3 directions at once. A delivery driver was unloading boxes from a van. The street was doing what streets do. I want to understand the full picture first, he said. Who Derek is. What the family knows. What the filing is actually designed to accomplish. He looked back at Renata. Then I want to respond correctly. Renata picked her glasses back up. She opened a new document on her laptop. Then let's get started, she said. What they built over the next 3 weeks was not a plan for revenge. Not exactly. It was something Andrew thought of as a full accounting. Every number on every page. Every relationship. Every dependency. Every load-bearing truth that the Hargrove family had been standing on without knowing who had built the floor. Derek Monroe was 39. He owned a small event planning and hospitality company in Atlanta. The business was mid-size, well-branded, busy enough to look successful. What it was not was financially stable. It carried a significant short-term debt from an expansion it had attempted 2 years prior. The expansion had not performed. Derek needed an investor. Or more specifically, he needed a connection to someone whose family name carried enough standing to open the right doors. Andrew read through Renata's research on a Thursday evening while sitting at the kitchen table after Camille had gone upstairs. The house still held both of them. Neither had moved out. The arrangement was quietly uncomfortable in the way that only people who were raised not to make scenes could tolerate. He read about Derek. He read about the business debt. He read the timeline. Derek and Camille had started spending time together at a charity gala 8 months ago. The same night Camille had come home smelling like a cologne Andrew had never owned. He sat with the timeline for a long time. He thought about the Sunday dinners. Diane's voice from the kitchen. Ordinary. He thought about Leland's handshake. Firm on the surface, hollow underneath. The handshake of a man who had already decided the person in front of him wasn't worth the full grip. He thought about the early years with Camille. Before the distance grew. Before her family's opinion became a weather system that sat over their marriage and changed the temperature of everything. He thought about the road trip they had taken to Savannah in their 2nd year together, the 2 of them in that fusion with the windows down and a playlist they'd built together, and Camille laughing at something on the radio so hard she had to cover her face. He had loved her completely in that moment. He had loved her for a long time after it. He knew when the love had changed. He didn't know the exact date, but he knew the shape of it. It had changed the way tides change, slowly, steadily, without announcing itself, until one morning you looked up and the shoreline was somewhere entirely different from where you remembered it. He grieved that quietly at the kitchen table with the document in front of him and the house dark and still above him. Then he turned the page, because grief and clarity were not the same thing, and he needed both. The Hargrove home in southwest Atlanta was a colonial-style house on a corner lot with a 2-car garage and a wraparound porch that Diane Hargrove had spent considerable money making look effortless. Andrew had sat at their dining table 14 times in 4 years. He had counted, not obsessively, just the way a man counts things when he is paying attention to patterns. 14 dinners. 14 opportunities for the family to decide he was worth the full version of their hospitality. They never had. Leland sat at the head of the table the way men sit when they have decided the table belongs to them. He carved the meat himself and distributed portions with the specific authority of someone who believed that generosity, when performed correctly, was its own kind of power. He told long stories about the early days of Hargrove Supply, stories his family had heard so many times they had developed the particular performance of attentive listening that was really just patience wearing a polite face. Andrew listened genuinely the first few times. He had always found the architecture of how people built things interesting, even when the person building it did not interest him. Diane sat across from Leland and managed the table the way a producer manages a set, refilling glasses before they were empty, steering conversation away from anything that might introduce difficulty, laughing at precisely the right moments. Toward Andrew, she was never openly unkind. That was the thing about Diane Hargrove. She was too intelligent for open unkindness. She operated in the register of the slightly too short pause before answering his question, the smile that arrived a half-second late, the way she would ask Camille about her week and then turn to Leland before Andrew had finished his own answer to the same question. Camille's younger brother Tobias was 28 and still figuring out what he wanted from life. He was not mean-spirited. He was simply not paying attention. He talked about himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never had to consider that other people in the room might be more interesting. The Sunday 2 weeks before the divorce filing, Andrew had sat at that table one final time without knowing it was final. Diane had made short ribs and a sweet potato dish that was genuinely excellent. Leland had opened a bottle of something he described as special occasion wine, without naming the occasion. Midway through dinner, Diane had looked at Camille across the table with the specific look of a woman who shares something with her daughter that the table is not fully party to, and Camille had looked back with the specific look of a woman who has been waiting to be seen in exactly this way. Andrew had watched it. He had not let his face change. He had taken a bite of the short rib and thought about the compliance document sitting in his work folder. After dinner, while Diane was in the kitchen and Leland and Tobias were watching something in the living room, Camille stood at the dining room window, and Andrew came to stand beside her. Just the two of them for a moment in the space between the table and the rest of the evening. "You good?" he asked her. She looked out the window. The porch light was on outside, catching the edge of the magnolia tree in the front yard. "I'm fine," she said. He stood next to her and said nothing for a moment. "You know," he said quietly, "I've tried, Camille. I want you to know I know that." She turned and looked at him. Something moved in her face, not remorse exactly. Something closer to recognition. The look of someone who has heard the truth and cannot immediately find the argument against it. She didn't answer. She turned back to the window. He nodded to himself. He went to find his coat. He had loved her. The marriage had not been a performance. He wanted that on the record, even if the only record was his own memory. He drove home alone that night. Camille stayed to help her mother with the kitchen. He sat in the driveway for 3 minutes after he parked. He looked at the house. Then he took out his phone and opened his email and reread the Hargrove Supply compliance summary he had sent himself for reference the prior week. He read it twice. He put his phone away. He went inside. Renata's office was on the 11th floor of a glass building in downtown Atlanta. Clean lines, natural light, a desk that looked like it had been chosen by someone who understood that the right workspace communicates seriousness before a single word is spoken. She spread 4 folders across the conference table when Andrew arrived on a Wednesday morning. She stood at the far end with a pen in her hand and the focused stillness of someone who had been awake early working through something and was ready to lay it all out. "Start with the filing," Andrew said. She opened the first folder. "Your wife's attorneys filed an aggressive asset disclosure claim that lists your consulting income, a joint investment account, and 2 individual savings accounts. They've also requested a review of any business interests or outside contracts tied to your name." She looked up. "That last piece is important." Andrew leaned forward slightly. "How specific is the language?" "Broad enough to cast a wide net, but not precise enough to have found anything yet. Whoever drafted this knew you had something to find. They just don't know what it is." He sat with that. "Derek Monroe," she continued, moving to the second folder, "has been in communication with Leland Hargrove for approximately 5 months. I found reference to 3 meetings in a public business registration filing that lists Derek's company as a potential co-venture partner with Hargrove Supply on a distribution facility expansion. Andrew looked at the folder. Leland is planning an expansion? He announced it internally to his staff 3 months ago. A new distribution facility in Macon. He's been pitching it to his bank as a growth play. Renata paused. The bank approved a preliminary term sheet conditional on Hargrove Supply maintaining its federal contract and demonstrating stable revenue through the next renewal cycle. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city moved through its Wednesday without knowing anything. Derek's event company, Andrew said slowly, needs a well-connected partner to recover from its expansion debt. Leland needs a development project to justify the Macon facility to his bank. They need each other. And they need the federal contract to hold, Renata said, to make all of it work. The contract you manage. Andrew looked at his hands on the table for a moment. They built a plan, he said, around a contract they don't know I control. That is what the evidence shows. He stood up and walked to the window. The city spread out below him, busy and indifferent, everyone moving through their own private architecture. He thought about Camille, not with bitterness, with something sadder and more honest. She was not a villain in his mind. She was a woman who had been pulled slowly in a direction by the gravity of her family's ambitions, by years of being told she deserved more, by a man who had appeared at exactly the right moment with exactly the right kind of confidence. He thought about whether she knew the full shape of what was happening around her, whether the divorce filing had been her idea, or whether she had simply been the mechanism through which her father and Derek were trying to clear the board. He thought about the Savannah road trip again, her laugh against the car window. He turned around. I want to know everything, he said. Not just the business structure, the timeline. Who knew what and when? Renata nodded. She was already writing. And Renata, she looked up. I want this done right. Not fast. Right. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the legal pad. Right takes 3 weeks, she said. Then we have 3 weeks, Andrew said. He buttoned his jacket and picked up his bag. At the door he paused. One more thing. Find out if Camille knew about the facility deal before or after she filed. He didn't say why it mattered, but it did. It mattered enormously. The difference between a woman who had been used and a woman who had chosen to participate in using him was the difference between grief and something else entirely. He needed to know which one he was carrying. 3 days later, Renata sent him a single paragraph with a date at the top. Camille had attended a dinner with Leland, Diane, and Derek Monroe 6 weeks before the divorce filing. The dinner was at a private restaurant in Buckhead. Renata had sourced the information from a social media post, since deleted, in which Tobias had tagged the restaurant and listed the attendees with a caption that said nothing specific but whose presence told the story. At that dinner, Camille had already known Derek for 2 months. Andrew read the paragraph twice. He set his phone face down on the kitchen counter. He stood there for a long moment with his hands flat on the cold surface, looking at the window above the sink and the dark yard beyond it. So she had known. She had sat at that table with her father and her mother and the man she was seeing and the man her father wanted as a business partner, and she had known all of it. And 6 weeks later she had walked into the kitchen and laid an envelope on the table like a verdict. He stood there long enough for the feeling to do what feelings do when you don't fight them. He let it arrive and move through him and settle somewhere it could be named. Then he picked up his phone and called Renata. We're moving forward, he said. Timeline. 3 weeks. As discussed. I'll have everything ready. He hung up. He went to the spare bedroom. Camille had been sleeping there for the past week, neither of them having made a formal declaration about it. The arrangement simply occurring the way arrangements occur between 2 people who are no longer speaking the same language. He sat at the small desk in the corner. He opened his laptop. He pulled up the Hargrove Supply Compliance Framework and began reviewing it with the careful, unhurried attention of a man reading something important for what would be the last time. He was not looking for errors. He was confirming the architecture, understanding the full weight of what he held. What he would do with that weight, exactly, was still taking shape in him. He was not a man who made decisions before they were ready, but he was close. Meanwhile, across Atlanta, the Hargrove house was lit and warm. Leland sat in his study with the preliminary bank term sheet on his desk, reading it the way he read everything, with the satisfaction of a man who had spent 61 years believing that his vision was always one step ahead of everyone around him. The Macon facility was going to work. Derek's co-venture was solid. The federal contract renewal was 3 months away. Everything was aligned. Or so it appeared. Diane knocked on the study door and leaned in. Camille called. "She sounds good." Leland nodded, still reading. "She'll be better once it's official." The attorney said 60 days, Diane said, stepping into the room. She should have the papers finalized before the holidays. Leland set the term sheet down and leaned back in his chair. "Should have done this 2 years ago," he said. Not cruelly. Matter-of-factly, the way he said most things. A man who can't grow is a man who holds people back. Diane stood near the bookshelf and looked at her husband with the expression of a woman who had made peace with agreeing out loud with things she was not entirely certain of in private. "He was always decent to her," she said, carefully. Leland looked at her. "Decent doesn't build anything, Diane." She didn't push further. She had learned, over 35 years of marriage, which hills were worth the climb. But later that night, after Leland had gone to sleep, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and thought about Andrew Wilson in the particular way you think about someone after you have said something about them that your conscience hasn't entirely approved. She thought about the way he had looked at Camille across the table. Steady, attentive, without performance. She thought about the time, 2 Thanksgivings ago, when their refrigerator had broken during dinner prep and Andrew had quietly driven 40 minutes to a hardware store and come back with the part that fixed it and said nothing about it at the table. Just fixed it. Just got it done. She picked up her tea. She drank it. She told herself she was being sentimental. She went to bed. The investigator's report arrived on a Friday morning in a plain folder that Renata handed to Andrew in person. He read it that evening at the kitchen table. Camille was at her parents' house. The house was quiet in the way it had been quiet for weeks. Not peaceful quiet, the quiet of a space that had been rearranged and hadn't yet decided what it was. The report was comprehensive. 37 pages. Sourced, annotated, organized exactly as requested. Derek Monroe had 2 prior significant relationships before Camille. The first was with a woman named Keisha Barton, whose family ran a catering and events firm in Charlotte with strong connections to the city's hospitality industry. Derek had dated Keisha for 9 months. During that time, he had attempted to negotiate a co-branding partnership between his company and her family's business. The deal stalled when the Barton family's legal counsel found inconsistencies in Derek's financials. The relationship ended within 6 weeks. The second was a woman named Simone Graves, whose family owned a regional hotel property in Savannah. Derek had dated Simone for 11 months. He had proposed a joint hospitality venture that would have used Graves' hotel as an anchor property. The proposal collapsed when Simone discovered Derek had simultaneously been negotiating with a competing hotel brand using the same projected numbers. The relationship ended immediately. No formal legal action. Third time. Same structure. Different family name. Camille Hargrove. The business communication section cited a public document from a civil partnership dispute between Derek and a former co-founder. The dispute had been settled, but its exhibits had never been sealed. One email, dated 11 months ago, 7 weeks before the charity gala where Derek met Camille. Hargrove Supply is the right size. Regional operation. Family controlled. Federal contract makes them bankable. Need the access point. Looking at the family structure. Daughter is well connected in the right circles. A follow-up, 3 weeks later. Confirmed. Gala at the Civic Center next month. She'll be there. Andrew set the folder down. He didn't rush past what that meant. He let it sit in him fully. The deliberateness of it, the design of it. The way Camille had been selected, the way a location is selected for a development project. Evaluated. Targeted. Pursued. He thought about whether to tell her. That question had a complicated shape. Telling her served her. It might also unravel everything prematurely. He was not ready for premature. But the question of whether to tell her stayed with him. He was not a man who made decisions from anger. He had never been that man. Anger was easy. Clarity was harder and more useful. He thought about the right order of things. Then he turned to the last section of the report. The section on the federal contract. Hargrove Supply's contract renewal was due in 93 days. The renewal required a compliance recertification signed by the managing analyst. The managing analyst was Andrew Wilson. He looked at that sentence for a long time. He closed the folder. He held it in his hands for a moment. just the weight of it, the physical reality of what it contained. Then he stood up, put the folder in the fireproof sleeve in the spare room desk, locked the drawer, and went to the kitchen to make dinner. He made a proper meal. He sat down and ate slowly. He cleaned up after himself. He went to bed at 10. He lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling. He was not at peace, but he was settled. There is a difference. Peace is the absence of conflict. Settled is knowing exactly where you stand inside the conflict and having decided what to do with that knowledge. He was settled. Renata filed the counter-response on a Monday morning. Andrew was at his desk reviewing a separate project when the confirmation came through. He read it. He set the phone face down. He went back to the project. The counter was 61 pages. Every asset claim in Camille's filing was contested with documentation. Every valuation was challenged. And attached at the back was a formal request for complete financial disclosure from both parties, including all correspondence between Camille Price and Derek Monroe related to any business arrangement, investment discussion, or financial benefit, past or present. Camille's attorney called Renata at 2:45 that same afternoon. He used phrases like reasonable compromise and expedient resolution and suggested that the discovery process could perhaps be streamlined for the benefit of both parties. Renata listened with the patience of someone who had heard that particular song before. "Please put any further requests in writing and direct them to my office," she said. She hung up before he reached his next sentence. Tobias called Andrew that Wednesday. It was the first time in 4 years that Tobias had called him without Camille being the reason. "Hey man," Tobias said. His voice carried the uncertain energy of someone who had been sent to do something he wasn't entirely sure he believed in. "Tobias, look, I'm just going to say what I'm saying." A pause. "My dad thinks this is getting complicated. He wanted me to reach out, see if there's a way to keep things simple. Like, you get a fair number, everybody moves forward, nobody has to make this ugly." Andrew looked out the window of his car. He was parked in the lot outside a diner where he'd had lunch. A woman was walking a stroller past. A kid was throwing a tennis ball at a wall. The world, doing its thing. "Tell your father," Andrew said, "that I appreciate the call, and that I'll be in touch soon, through the appropriate channels." What does that mean? It means exactly what it sounds like. A longer pause. "Devontae, my dad doesn't." "Andrew," he said. "Calm, clear, final. Right? Sorry." Tobias sounded genuinely flustered. "Andrew, look, are we good? Like, I never had a problem with you." Andrew considered that. Tobias was not the architect of any of this. He was 28 years old and had spent his whole life in the gravitational pull of his father's certainties. That wasn't a crime. It was just a life that hadn't required him to think very hard yet. "We're fine, Tobias," Andrew said. "You're not who I have a conversation with about this." He ended the call. He drove back to the office. That evening he sat across from Renata at her conference table with 2 cups of coffee between them and a yellow legal pad covered in her handwriting. "Board of Review," she said, without looking up. "If the recertification is flagged for administrative review during the renewal cycle, standard hold period is 60 to 90 days. During that hold, disbursements under the contract are paused. Hargrove Supply's credit line, which is contingent on demonstrating active federal contract status, would be reviewed by its primary lender. And the Macon facility financing, conditional on that credit line. If the line is reviewed midterm, the bank's preliminary approval is likely withdrawn pending resolution." "And Derek's co-venture?" Renata looked up. "Derek Monroe's business recovery plan is entirely dependent on Leland Hargrove's expansion moving forward. If the expansion stalls, Derek has no path to solvency." Andrew wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "I'm not trying to destroy the business," he said. "People work there. They have families." "I know," Renata said. She said it without impatience, the way someone says something when they have already understood the limits you are setting and have planned inside them. "Then what's the version that holds people accountable without burning the floor out from under the people who didn't do anything?" Renata set her pen down. She looked at him directly. "The version," she said, "where you call a meeting, where everything is disclosed, where Leland understands, fully and clearly, what he has been standing on, and then where the decision about what happens next is made transparently, with every card on the table." She picked up the legal pad. "That version is harder," she said. "It requires you to be the reasonable one in the room when you have every right not to be." Andrew nodded slowly. "That's the version," he said. The conference room at Renata's firm had floor-to-ceiling windows on the east side. By 9 in the morning, the light came in flat and clean and laid itself across the long table in white strips that made the room feel more exposed than anyone sitting in it was comfortable with. Andrew arrived first. Dark jacket, pressed slacks, a folder in his hand. He sat at the center of the table, not at the head, deliberately. He set the folder in front of him and folded his hands on top of it and looked out the window at the city. He was not calm because nothing was at stake. He was calm because everything was, and he had made his peace with that. Leland arrived with his attorney, a contained man named Garrett who wore expensive shoes and had the practiced composure of someone paid a great deal to project it. Leland sat across from Andrew and looked at him with the specific expression of a man attending to an inconvenience he fully expects to resolve in his favor. Camille sat 2 seats down from her father. She wore a gray blazer. Her hands were folded. She looked at the table when she first sat down, and then she looked at Andrew, and something in her expression shifted slightly, the way a face shifts when a person is looking at something that contains more than they were prepared for. Diane sat at the far end, straight-backed, composed, present. Tobias was not there. Andrew noted that. Renata sat to Andrew's right. Her legal pad was open. Her pen was in her hand. She looked entirely comfortable. Leland's attorney opened. The settlement terms were familiar: asset division, buyout of joint accounts, full release of claims. He presented it with the measured confidence of someone who believed the other side had less than they knew. Andrew let him finish. Then Renata said, "We're declining those terms. Before any framework can be finalized, there are disclosures this table needs to review." She reached into her briefcase. She placed a document packet in front of Leland, one in front of Garrett, one in front of Camille. She kept one and set one in front of Andrew, who did not open it. "Take your time," she said. The first page was a standard federal contract summary. Hargrove Supply and Distribution, contract number, term dates, annual value. Leland looked at it and his expression didn't change because this was familiar. His contract. His company. He turned the page. The next pages were something different. They showed the internal compliance structure of the contract, the review chain, the certification signatories. Each name listed was either a department title or a specific individual. On the 4th page, the managing analyst's name was listed. Andrew Anthony Wilson. Leland looked at it. He read it again. He turned back to the page before it, then forward again. His hand was flat on the document, and the room was doing the thing rooms do when the temperature of what is known has just changed entirely. Camille read it. She looked up at Andrew and then back down. She read it again. Her face had gone very still. Diane's composure slipped slightly, just at the eyes. A softening, like someone who had already suspected something was wrong and was now receiving confirmation. "What is this?" Leland's voice was controlled. Carefully controlled. The voice of a man pressing weight onto something he wasn't sure would hold. Andrew looked at him steadily. 3 years ago, Hargrove Supply applied for a federal supply contract through Meridian Federal Consulting's procurement division. I built the compliance framework that got you approved. I am the managing analyst on your account. My recertification signature is what makes your contract renewable. Leland's jaw moved without producing words. Andrew continued, his voice the same even, unhurried register it always carried. I have never used that position to influence anything in our personal relationship. I never mentioned it to Camille. I never mentioned it to you. My professional work and my marriage were kept completely separate because that is how I operate. He paused. But you should know what I hold. Because the decisions being made at this table affect more than just our marriage. The room was quiet. Then Renata set the second packet on the table, directly in front of Leland. Garrett, his attorney, reached for it, but Leland got there first. This, Renata said, is about Derek Monroe. Camille's hands pressed together on the table. Leland opened the packet. He read the first page. The timeline. The prior relationships. Keisha Barton, Simone Graves. The pattern. Documented, sourced, annotated. He turned to the page with the email. Hargrove Supply is the right size. Family controlled. Federal contract makes them bankable. Need the access point. He read it once. He read it again. His hand was very still on the page. Camille made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound. The kind that escapes before you can stop it, when something you have been not quite letting yourself think becomes unavoidable. Was any of it real? She said quietly. She was not asking Andrew. She was not asking anyone in the room exactly. She was asking the document, the timeline, the version of the past 8 months that had just rearranged itself in front of her. Camille, Leland started. Dad. She said the word with a quietness that stopped him completely. She looked at Andrew for the first time since sitting down. Fully looked at him. Her eyes held something complicated, grief and something closer to recognition. The look of a woman who had just understood the shape of several things at once. I didn't know about the contract, she said. I didn't know you. I know, Andrew said. Quiet. Even. I know you didn't. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down. Leland set the packet down. He looked at Andrew across the table. The patrician's certainty, the posture of a man who had never doubted his own authority, was still there. But something behind his eyes was doing the math. Reluctantly. The way a person does math when they already know the answer and do not want it. What do you want? Leland asked. His voice was careful. Andrew looked at him. I want this resolved honestly, he said. Not conveniently. Honestly. He opened his folder for the first time. I'm not moving against the contract, he said. The people who work for you didn't do anything wrong. I'm not going to use my position to hurt them. He looked at Leland directly. But I want the Macon facility expansion and Derek Monroe's co-venture agreement formally dissolved before any divorce settlement is signed. Because both of those things were built on a foundation they had no right to use. He slid a single-page document across the table. A dissolution agreement. Prepared by Renata. Clean, precise. And I want a full audit of the divorce filing, Andrew continued. To establish clearly who drafted the language that targeted my business interests and whether that drafting was coordinated with Derek Monroe's attorneys. He folded his hands on the table. Sign those 2 things, and I'll complete the recertification on schedule. The contract renews. The company continues. Everyone who depends on it is protected. He looked at Leland without blinking. That's what ordinary looks like, he said. When it actually shows up. Leland signed the dissolution agreement 2 days later. He did it in his attorney's office, not at a table where Andrew could see his face, which was probably wise for everyone. The Macon facility expansion was put on indefinite hold, pending a full financial review that Leland initiated himself, perhaps to get ahead of what the audit might surface, or perhaps because, in the quiet after everything, he had looked at the numbers with new eyes and found them less sound than he had told himself. Derek Monroe received formal written notification from Hargrove Supply's legal counsel that the co-venture agreement was dissolved and that the company had no present or future interest in any joint development. He received this on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, his primary banking contact had received a courtesy copy of the dissolution notice. 2 of Derek's investors, both of whom had committed preliminary capital based on the Hargrove Supply anchor arrangement, withdrew within the week. The event company did not fold immediately, but it listed, the way things list when the weight that was holding them steady is removed. The civil complaint from Derek's former co-founder, the one whose exhibits contained the email about Camille and the Hargrove family structure, found its way into the hands of 2 individuals Renata described only as the appropriate parties. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. Derek Monroe's business required a particular kind of trust to function. The trust of investors, of partners, of families willing to share their names and their networks. That trust did not survive what the appropriate parties now knew. The divorce was finalized 58 days after Renata filed the counter-response. The settlement was fair, genuinely fair, not the performance of fairness that the original filing had been dressed up as. Andrew received an equitable division of the joint accounts, full ownership of his personal investment holdings, and no claims against his consulting work. The aggressive asset language from the original filing was entirely removed. Camille kept the house. That had been Andrew's decision. He did not want the house. The house contained years of a life that had been real to him and had then slowly stopped being real, and living in it without that reality seemed worse than starting somewhere new. He found an apartment on the east side of Atlanta. Clean lines, good windows, a small balcony that faced the morning light. He moved in on a Saturday with less than he expected to move with, and stood in the empty living room afterward and looked at the space. It was his. Entirely his. No waiting in it. No watching. No carefully maintained quiet that served a purpose. Just space. He ordered dinner that night and ate it standing at the kitchen counter because he didn't have a table yet. He bought a table the following week. He chose it carefully, The right size for one person to eat at, and for two people to sit across from each other comfortably if that occasion arose. He was not closing any doors. He was just not pretending they were open when they weren't. Diane Hargrove called on a Sunday evening, 3 weeks after the finalization. Andrew was on the balcony with a book he hadn't started reading yet, because the evening light on the city was more interesting. He looked at her name on the screen for 2 full rings. He answered, "Andrew." Her voice was not what he expected. It was not the carefully managed warmth she deployed at dinner tables. It was quieter, more worn. The voice of a woman who had been sitting with something for several weeks and had finally decided to say it. "Mrs. Hargrove, I know I have no standing to call you," she said. "I'm not calling on behalf of anyone. Not Leland. Not Camille." A pause. "Just myself." "All right." She was quiet for a moment. He let her find her way to it. "I called you ordinary once," she said. "You weren't supposed to hear that. But I imagine you did, because you hear everything." Another pause, longer. "I was wrong. I want to say that plainly. Not as an excuse and not as a way of changing anything. Just because it's true, and true things deserve to be said out loud." Andrew looked at the city below. A line of car lights on the freeway. The lit windows of 100 lives going about their business. "I hear you, Mrs. Hargrove," he said. "I'm sorry," she said. "For what I said. And for what I didn't say. All the times I should have." Andrew held the phone for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. Genuinely. They did not speak again after that call. But the call mattered. It settled into the record of what had passed between Andrew Wilson and the Hargrove family, like the only clean entry in a document that was otherwise complicated. It was the only moment that carried anything close to grace, and he held it as such. 14 months later, Andrew sat on his balcony on a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 1 year and 3 days after a divorce filing had been set on his kitchen table. He had a coffee cup in both hands. The city below was still doing its slow morning assembly. Lights coming on in buildings, a bus pulling away from a corner stop, the particular blue of an early Georgia sky that lasted about 20 minutes before the full light arrived and turned it into just a regular day. He was not the same man who had sat at that kitchen table. Not dramatically different. The blazers were the same. The fusion had finally gotten its mirror fixed. He still packed his lunch every morning. He was still precise, still quiet, still the kind of man who read a document 7 times before signing his name. But something in him had settled that had not been settled before. Not the settling of a man who had won something. The settling of a man who had said what was true when it mattered, who had chosen the harder right over the easier wrong, and who had come through the other side of a painful thing without becoming something he didn't want to be. He had been promoted at Meridian Federal 6 months after the divorce. The promotion had nothing to do with the Hargrove situation. It was based on a compliance framework he had built for a regional infrastructure project that his supervisor called the most thorough work the department had produced in 3 years. He had received the news in an email. He had read it twice. He had replied with 3 professional sentences. He had gone back to the project in front of him. The Hargrove supply contract renewed on schedule. Every employee who worked there kept their job. The company stabilized, though without the Macon expansion, more slowly than Leland had imagined. Leland was still running the operation. The silver had spread further at his temples. The stories at dinner, Tobias mentioned in a brief and friendly text Andrew received once, were slightly shorter now. Camille was living in Marietta. She had taken a position with a nonprofit that worked on housing access for low-income families. People who knew her said she was different, more grounded, less interested in being seen in the right rooms. Whether that was loss reshaping into something better, Andrew didn't know. He hoped it was. Derek Monroe had quietly restructured his business, shedding the expansion and returning to the smaller, more sustainable version of what he had built originally. No co-ventures, no anchor partners, no strategies built on other people's family names. Whether that was genuine change or just correction of necessity, Andrew also did not know. That wasn't his territory anymore. That had stopped being his territory the moment the settlement was signed. Renata had taken him to dinner at a good restaurant 2 months after the finalization. Just the two of them, sitting across from each other at a corner table with real food and a bottle of wine, talking about everything and nothing for 3 hours. She was one of the finest people he knew. He told her that, plainly, over the last glass. She had looked at him with the expression of someone receiving something they didn't expect and deciding it was true. He was having dinner with her, and her husband on Fridays now. Those evenings were easy in the way that only very old trust can make evenings easy. He was also, slowly and without pressure, beginning to be curious about what came next. Not urgently, not desperately, just the quiet, honest curiosity of a man who knew himself well enough to know he was not built for permanent solitude, who believed that love, done right, was one of the few things worth the risk of doing it again. He sat on the balcony and drank his coffee. The sky moved through its 20 minutes of particular blue. He thought about something his mother had told him when he was 17 and had been passed over for a scholarship he had worked hard for. She had sat across from him at their kitchen table, 2 cups of tea between them, and she had said, not to comfort him, but because she meant it, "Andrew, what belongs to you cannot be taken from you, and what tries to take it will always show you, in the end, exactly what it is." He had thought about that sentence many times in the past 14 months. He had thought about what it meant to hold something carefully, to build something real, to be, without performance, exactly who you were, and to trust that the right people would eventually see it clearly. He had been wrong about some things. He had trusted longer than he should have. He had been patient in ways that cost him years. He did not regret the patience. He regretted that it had been necessary. But he did not carry the past the way some people carry it, heavy and close, pressed against their chest, letting it determine the temperature of every room they entered. He set his coffee cup down on the balcony railing. He looked at the city for a few more minutes. Then he went inside. He rinsed the cup. He dried it and set it back in the cabinet. He made his lunch, the same way he always made it, carefully, without apology, without performance. He put on his coat. He picked up his bag. He checked the door lock. He stepped out into the morning. The street was awake now. The blue sky had done what blue skies do. Expanded, brightened, become the full, clear, generous thing it had been promising to be since before the sun finished rising. Andrew Wilson walked toward his car. He was not small. He had never been small. He had just been in rooms where people had confused quiet for empty, and precision for limitation, and patience for surrender. He knew exactly what he was. He had always known. Now, finally, so did everyone else. If this story stayed with you until the very end, you already know what it means. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Tomorrow's story carries the same weight, and you don't want to miss it.